Tuesday. We need to take you live to Melbourne now, and the Greens Deputy Leader and the federal member for Melbourne, Adam Bandt.
Well, it won't work. From day one, the Greens have said that we will hold the seat of Melbourne in our own right. That's our goal, and not to have to rely on preferences from any other party. And we've worked steadily towards that over the last few years. People in Melbourne have seen that we've delivered free dental care for 3.4 million kids around the country, $13 billion going into clean and renewable energy and a world-leading price on pollution, as well as some of the first steps towards high-speed rail on the East Coast. We've also been a strong voice in the Parliament at a time when Labor and Tony Abbott are engaged in a race to the bottom. We've stood up for a compassionate, practical and humane approach to deal with people who are coming here seeking our help. To win the seat of Melbourne in our own right, we only need here a small increase in our primary vote. We got 36% last time. That was off the back of a 13% swing as people in Melbourne made history by voting for the Greens. With a swing somewhere in the order of about 5%, so just over a third of what we got last time, we'll be able to hold the seat of Melbourne in our own right. What the announcement today of the preference arrangement that appears to have been struck between Labor and Tony Abbott does do, though, is make the choice for Melbourne very stark. People in Melbourne can do what Tony Abbott wants them to do, or they can vote Green. It speaks volumes that Tony Abbott would rather have a Labor backbencher in the seat of Melbourne than me, and I wear it as a badge of honour. Tony Abbott knows that a Labor backbencher will vote to cut single-parent payments, to slash university funding, to keep refugees in indefinite detention. The Greens won't. And that's why the old parties find themselves increasingly agreeing on all of the issues that matter. And if there was any proof of that was needed, you only had to look at the very minimal points of difference on offer in the debate that we recently saw. I have people every day in Melbourne coming to me saying, look, we have had enough of Labor's race to the bottom, trying to out-tough Tony Abbott, a man for whom there's nothing too low that he won't stoop to. And people are telling me they're changing their votes. The phones in the office have run hot this morning as people ring up to say, what can we do to assist you in your campaign? What's crystal clear from this is that the Greens are now the real opposition to Tony Abbott.
Why is it okay for you to win your seat in 2010, as you did in 2010 on the back of Liberal preferences, but not for the Labor candidate to do the same?
Well, we're aiming to win the seat in our own right.
But I think it's a preference deal which you benefited from in 2010.
Well, I think it's amazing that the state of the modern Labor Party is such that they run around the rest of the country saying Tony Abbott is awful and is a threat to the country, but here in the inner city seats, the only way that they could potentially limp over the line and win a seat is with Tony Abbott's assistance.
Exactly
it shows just how close they've become. Well, we're aiming this time to win the seat in our own right. And that's something that I think the Greens have to do as we grow and become the next major political party in this country. It's important for us to be able to win seats in our own right, and that's what I'm aiming to do.
So you're going to become a major political party, but Kevin Rudd has now ruled out any deal or formal agreement if he needs to form a minority government again. Why are the Greens now such pariahs? No one wants to deal with them on that basis.
Well, Kevin Rudd needs to come clean on what the quid pro quo for this arrangement with the Liberals is. Is Labor now going to preference the Liberals in seats like Mallee, as has been reported over the last couple of days? What is the Labor-Tony Abbott preference deal that has resulted in this decision being made this morning? But look, I think it's the height of arrogance for leaders of other political parties to say they're not prepared to work with the people that the Australian public put into Parliament. This period of Parliament has been one of the most productive we've seen. we've been able to get reform on dental care. We've been able to get money into schools. We've been able to work to get a clean energy legislation package through, something that Kevin Rudd was never able to do with a majority parliament. It is the height of arrogance to say you won't work with others. At the last election, 1.6 million people around the country voted for the Greens. Now, that's over 11%. If you had the number of people in the House of Representatives actually reflecting the number of people who voted for us, there'd probably be about another 15 Greens MPs sitting in there. There is a widespread desire amongst the Australian population to say, look, we want more than the two old parties, the Coles and Woolworths of politics, who aren't really offering us anything different anymore. So many people are looking for third voices in Parliament, and it's the obligation of all political leaders to work together. I think people want to see more of that.
Do you or the Greens accept any responsibility at all for the instability in the Parliament over the last 3 years?
The two major causes of the instability, firstly has been Tony Abbott's refusal to accept the legitimacy of the election result, and he's gone out of its way to make it appear as if the whole thing was about to fall over, whereas in fact we delivered a lot and it ran its full term. The second major cause of instability has been Labor's massive internal turmoil. On days when we were passing really significant pieces of legislation, you'd open up the newspaper and front page would be about more Labor leadership instability. Julia Gillard's own side never really gave her a fair go and spent the best part of 2.5 years tearing her down, and that's what contributed to the appearance of instability, even though when you look at the record, what we did was 99 times out of 100 get Labor, Greens, country independents, city independents working together, getting on the same page.
But what about the policy purity of the Greens on issues such as offshore processing of asylum seekers? Did that not at all contribute to the atmospherics and tensions around the Malaysia swap deal at the time?
Well, the legislation that passed through Parliament is always a result of people not getting exactly what they want, but all working together to decide it's better than nothing. And that's the approach that the Greens took to this Parliament that we continue to take. We're not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If legislation results in a positive step forward for the community, then we vote for it, provided that it can be improved on at a later stage, and provided it doesn't involve taking a step backwards and trading off some fundamental principles. And what we saw when it came to the question of refugees in this Parliament, as has been amply illustrated by the recent announcements, is Labor chooses Tony Abbott as its dancing partner on this issue. And it wants to be as much like the coalition when it comes to refugees as it possibly can, even going further than the coalition if it needs to. Labor is not, and was not during this Parliament, interested in thinking about what a practical and humane solution to provide safer pathways might look like. It was all driven by polls and focus groups and what they thought the people in Western Sydney wanted. And we've seen that amply on display when Kevin Rudd gets up and makes announcements about how we're going to put people on other countries and force them to live their lives there. And then you get some recanting of that a few days later by the Prime Minister of that other country. You see that this isn't being driven by a good policy approach from Labor, it's being driven by the polls.
And what, in your view, is a practical and humane solution to such a complex issue then?
It's about providing safer pathways for people, especially those in our region, in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, who are getting so desperate that because they see no way out of the camps that they're in or no other safe route to get to this country, that they're risking their own and their families' lives on boats. What we would do is do what worked in this country before. We would take the framework of the approach from Malcolm Fraser and update it. We would increase our refugee intake to 30,000. We would process 3,800 more people immediately from the region, including from places like Indonesia. And then when people in the camps in Indonesia and Malaysia see that there's a safe pathway to get to Australia, then all the advice that we've got is that that will remove the risk of them getting on boats. And I mean, just think about this practically for a sense. I mean, here in Melbourne, we've got people living in Richmond who are part of the 90,000 people from Vietnam and their families that Australia took in the decade after the Vietnam War. and many of those people came here by boat. Under Labor's current policy, they wouldn't be here. They'd be forced to go and rot on PNG or Nauru. And that is what we're talking about here, and that's why the Greens plan has the backing of the people like Julian Burnside and Malcolm Fraser and the refugee advocates.
You were talking before about Labor and Liberal preference deals. What will the Greens be doing in terms of its own preferencing arrangements?
I don't know. That will ultimately be a matter for the party. They're involved in those issues. In the lower house seats, we will be encouraging people to vote one Greens and then decide themselves how they want to allocate their preferences. I think there's often perhaps a lack of understanding about how that part of the voting system works. And the reality is that people are able to allocate their own preferences. And can I say, in Melbourne, I think there will be a lot of people from across the political spectrum, including those who are aligned to the Liberal Party, who won't be happy with Tony Abbott directing them to send their preferences to a Labor backbencher. There are a lot of Liberal-inclined voters that I speak to who, when they understand that the choice is between an independent local voice in the Greens or a Labor backbencher who will do what they're told by the factional heads, would prefer to see a Greens there and will direct their preferences accordingly.
On the question of sex appeal, you've recently featured in an article about politicians with brains and beauty. How does that make you feel, and how do you think it's different from saying a candidate's got a bit of sex appeal?
I think that people who are running for office should be judged on the quality of their character. And I think over the last couple of years in politics, it's done a lot to discourage women from standing. I think the treatment of former Prime Minister Gillard, for example, was treatment that wouldn't have been dished out to a bloke. I don't think that John Howard would ever have been asked on air whether his wife was gay. I don't think that former male Prime Ministers would have thought it was appropriate for there to be the kind of signs that we saw standing behind Tony Abbott describing the Prime Minister at rallies. And I think that the state of debate in the country at the moment is potentially going the way of discouraging women from running. And part of that is a feeling that women will be judged differently to others. And so that's what concerns me about some of the comments recently. It's nice that other people want to put my name up on a website, but I hope that they're judging me on what I've been able to deliver.
Abbott's decision today has obviously made it difficult for you in the seat of Melbourne, but what about in other seats like Randall and Brisbane, where the Greens are obviously trying to pick up lower house seats? Does it rule that out?
Well, we'll continue to campaign very strongly in those seats, and I think if the indication of the phones in my office this morning is any indication, it will sharpen the choice for people and make people realise that the Greens are the real opposition to Tony Abbott. Those other seats were like Melbourne. It took several goes to build up the seat of Melbourne, to the point where a lot of people said, yeah, I do want to vote Greens one. But we'll continue to campaign strongly in those other seats.
Are you worried that the 2010 result was a high watermark for the Greens?
No, I think we're going to go on to bigger and better things. I think that unlike other parties that have come before us, say like the Democrats really define themselves in relation to the others. I mean, you just have to think about their slogan. We have a core set of values that are increasingly striking a chord with the Australian people. And I think the pressures that are on our planet and that are on our society, and the fact that society is becoming a less caring place, the gap between rich and poor is growing, people will see that it's only the Greens who are standing up for that, for a more caring society and a cleaner economy, and our vote will continue to grow.
Do you think the major parties are trying to deal the Greens out of existence?
There is obviously a sense amongst the old parties that the Greens are a threat because we hold them to account and we show up just how much they increasingly agree on all of the things that matter. Labor and Tony Abbott want to keep the Parliament as a two-party closed shop, and we've seen another indication of that today. but people around the country want to hear their voices represented in Parliament and want members of Parliament to work together. So Labor and the coalition can try as much as they like to hold back the tide, but people will have their say and different voices will be represented in Parliament.
If you don't win the seat of Melbourne, would you put your hand up for a Senate spot in the future?
I'm not focused on anything other than winning the seat of Melbourne and my wedding at the end of the year. They're the things that I'm focused on at the moment. Look, this is an important election for everyone, and it's an important election for the Greens. To be the next major party, we need to be in a position where people can run the ruler over our costings in the same way as they can with other parties. People can expect us to behave with the same, or hopefully a higher level of decency than the other parties, and people can look at us and know that we'll win seats in our own right. And so that has been and remains my sole focus. And as far as the election goes, I'm not thinking about anything else.
Speaking of costings, you've come out against the East-West link and have said you'll introduce sort of a range of transport policies that will be sort of fully costed within the course of the next few weeks. You've said you'll pay for those transport policies by redirecting money away from allocated or unallocated road projects. Which road projects would the Greens cut to fund public transport projects?
Look, we'll make an announcement about that, and we've been very clear that we support continued funding for road safety related projects. So anything to do with safety, that funding would be locked in and guaranteed. But there are projects like the West Connects project that are proposed to be built in Sydney, for example, that is not something that the Greens would fund. We would rather that money go into public transport. Something else that might have slipped under the radar over the last few weeks is that the Greens, when we've announced our policies, have announced how much they will cost, and where their spending-related initiatives we've announced where the money will come from. And what you'll find this election is that the Greens will be the only economically responsible party, because not only are we getting our policies and our initiatives costed, but we're the only ones saying that there's a revenue crisis in this country, and unless we address that, then future governments will have two choices. They'll either start cutting or keep cutting the services or the benefits that we get as single parents and universities have found out, or they're going to start increasing the taxes that the rest of us have to pay, which is why we're having wide-ranging discussions about increasing the GST in the public. Tony Abbott said today, well, one of the reasons that he's decided to do a deal with Labor is that, try and install people from the Labor Party into Parliament, is that the Greens want a proper mining tax and a modest levy on the big banks. Well, I'll tell you what, if you ask most people, how are we going to make up the budget shortfall? Should we cut universities and single parents? Or should we do what the Treasury said and have a proper mining tax, and do what the IMF said and impose a modest levy on the banks, the big four banks that are the most profitable in the world? I know what most people would say. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Federal member for Melbourne there, the Greens representative Adam Bandt speaking at Flagstaff Gardens. David Lipson is with me.